Okay, hello and welcome to another session of the Ringvorlesung of the Universities. And this time we introduce a new university and a new face here. That's Anouk Aerni, who hails from the University in Basel. And she completed her master in literary studies at that university in 2017 and was one of those people that got the startup grants that Basel made available around back then, which cost me two of my promising PhD students already, because gotta hand it to them, it's like having kidnapped Santa Claus. You know, it's really a lot of money and it's very good working conditions. But she tells me that now they've cut that program down to only 2 positions, but they are real positions then at the university, which has its advantages. So started working on her PhD thesis April 2018 and has since been working on it under the title A Farewell to Anthropocentrism, polysyllabic words, in postmodern American postbellum prose, and under the supervision of my friend Philipp Schweighauser, who will be a guest in this lecture series in late January, if I remember correctly. By now, Anouk Aerni has also published her first article, A Farewell to Anthropocentrism in American Postbellum Prose, an ecocritical reconsideration of Tim O'Brien's The Things They Carried. And if you haven't read Tim O'Brien's The Things They Carried yet, you should. It will give you a much better understanding of what the Vietnam War was all about. Her main research focus normally lies on American literature, particularly of the 20th century and the 21st, modernist and postmodernist. So I'm especially grateful that for today she will have a look at the 19th century and at particularly at Stephen Crane's Red Badge of Courage. And I quote from the abstract of today's lecture: as a literary critical approach, ecocriticism works against the anthropocentric assumptions of human exceptionalism and anthropological difference by challenging the nature-human dualism at the root of the predominant Western worldview, which places humans not only opposite, but outside and above nature. And yeah, let's see how that works for Stephen Crane's Red Badge of Courage. Anouk Aerni, thank you for being here.
Thank you for that introduction. I'm going to start by sharing the screen. It should work. We tried it out already. So you should all be seeing my presentation now. If not, just raise a hand. And I think we'll jump right into it. It is probably going to be rather dense, but I think together we can get through it. So the aim of today's presentation is to display the ways in which classic works of literature can be reread in ways that shed light onto dimensions often overlooked in the body of existing scholarship. For that purpose, I will demonstrate today one of the ways in which Stephen Crane's The Red Badge of Courage can be read from eco-critical perspective by using methods derived from my own analyses of 20th century war novels. Within the framework of my PhD thesis, I've developed strategies that allow me to critically engage with the ways in which mid to late 20th century postbellum prose portrays and negotiates humans, nature, and their relationship. I believe that reading postmodern American postbellum prose from an eco-critical standpoint yields interesting insights concerning our predominant worldview in regard to our attitude towards nature. In addition, I believe that many of the elements that I have identified within this body of work are not period specific, but rather common to the broader range of American war novels. In my master thesis, I provided an analysis of a modernist work, A Farewell to Arms by Ernest Hemingway, showing that even though it was written prior to what is often considered the advent of ecological consciousness in the broader public and its adaptation into the scientific field of the humanities, the portrayal of the nature-human relationship within the text challenges the dichotomous understanding of these two entities and thereby posits that humans and nature are inextricably connected and interacting entities. In that sense, I will use my time today to demonstrate how even earlier works can be read from this standpoint to reveal the unnaturalness of the nature-human dichotomy and thereby suggest a more differentiated understanding of the nature-human relationship. I'm trying, yes. So first, I will begin by giving you a brief overview of the most important terms and concepts in regard to today's topic. That means I will introduce some of the key concepts of the field of ecocriticism. In doing so, I will present some of the main issues underlying and fortifying the anthropocentrism at the base of Western thinking that I aim to challenge with my work. This will also give you an idea as to why it is important to renegotiate the human-nature relationship in the first place. Second, I will move on to the topic of nature, humans, and their relationship. I will elaborate on the way in which I understand these entities, their relation, and how they are portrayed within the body of literature discussed. Following that, I will touch upon the reasons why post-war and war narratives are especially suited for this kind of approach, and what genre-specific features or elements that transcend the boundary of time have proven to be a particularly fruitful breeding ground for eco-critical rereadings. The third and main part of my presentation will then be focused on eco-critical reading itself. For that, I will offer insights and examples from my readings of two works, Tim O'Brien's short story collection, The Things They Carried, and James Webb's war novel, Fields of Fire, which are both centered around the Vietnam War. I will then show you that even though the Red Badge of Courage is separated from the former two by an admittedly rather significant age gap of around 80 to 95 years, interesting similarities can be discerned between this older naturalist novel and its postmodernist successors. Owing to Crane's indisputable legacy, for one thing, and genre-specific elements that can be traced throughout all of these works, many of the reading strategies I will introduce to you today warrant a similar result when used to engage with Crane's novel, as they do when applying them to 20th century works. Most importantly, as the Red Badge of Courage is often understood to be a paradigmatic example of a novel displaying nature's indifference towards human affairs, an eco-critical renegotiation of the text may even demand a revaluation of this deduction, or in the very least, suggest that there is more to be added to existing conclusions. Key terms and concepts. One of the key motivators that pushed me to work in the field of ecocriticism is the obvious fact that today we live in a world in which humans influence the environment in unprecedented ways. Because of the fact that since around the mid-20th century until today, the magnitude and rate at which humanity has impacted the planet has increased drastically, this time span is referred to by many as the Great Acceleration. The extensive impact humans' collective actions have on the planet are no longer deniable. Signs of anthropogenic changes to the Earth's ecology include the rise of global temperatures, deforestation, increase in greenhouse gases, increased CO2 emissions, the destruction of natural habitats, the radioactive fallout, and widespread pollution. Now, this list is in nowhere near exhaustive, also considering the related secondary issues these effects bear, such as, for example, rising sea levels as a result of thermal expansions and the melting of glaciers caused by overall warming temperatures. But it already goes to show the diversity and magnitude of the consequences of human activity. More importantly, it shows that human history and Earth history cannot be treated and told as separate narratives. Isolated storytelling is detrimental because it ignores the interconnectedness between the human and the non-human and the reciprocal nature of their relationship. Going hand in hand with this development, I want to emphasize two key terms, namely anthropocentrism and human exceptionalism. Human exceptionalism is fueled by the misguided idea that humans are separable from nature and posits that humans are exceptionally and essentially different from nature, facilitating the idea that human history and Earth history are separable narratives. This notion then enables the anthropocentric worldview within Western culture that posits humans not only as the center of, but as apart from instead of a part of nature. Anthropocentrism, or human-centeredness, reinforces the traditional binary distinction between nature and culture, or humans and nature, so to speak, as well as the hierarchy therein that sees humans as the apex of creation. It is a worldview that posits humans as morally more important than the non-human, whereas ecocentrism, in contrast, emphasizes the moral importance of a natural or ecological whole. Similarly, the term anthropological difference means viewing humans as inherently and fundamentally different and superior to non-human animals, and as a result, nature overall. Already, increased and still growing awareness of anthropogenic influence, that is to say, of human-induced consequences, has aided in revealing anthropocentrism as a fundamentally flawed assumption based on differentiation and ignorance towards the intricate connection between the human and the non-human, as well as the misguided idea of anthropological difference that goes hand in hand with the notion of human exceptionalism. Acknowledging the fact that as humans, we are not separable from nature, but an active participant and part of our environment, and thereby recognizing that we are not, after all, fundamentally different from the non-human, is the first step to accepting responsibility for our actions and their consequences in nature, as well as towards reformulating the ways in which we perceive ourselves, our environment, and our relationship with the latter. Another term, one that most of you will probably have heard before and which seeks to draw attention to this issue, is that of the Anthropocene. It was first introduced by Crutzen and Stormer in the year 2000 to denote the successor of the preceding geological era, the Holocene. The coinage of the term is based on the assumption that since the Industrial Revolution, and even more increasingly so since the dawn of the Great Acceleration, humans have become geological agents. As Dipesh Chakrabarty said, humans are biological agents, both collectively and as individuals. They have always been so. There was no point in human history when humans were not biological agents. But we can become geological agents only historically and collectively, that is, when we have reached numbers and invented technologies that are on a scale large enough to have an impact on the planet itself. Since at least the 1960s, we have reached that point. In that sense, human influence on the planet is not something that started recently, but rather a process that has built up and gained speed over centuries, even millennia, but especially so during the 20th century. While temporally speaking, humans have been around for only the blink of an eye on the scale of planetary time, the magnitude of their impact is unprecedented. That is why the coinage and especially the spreading of terms like the Anthropocene is important, whether or not one entirely agrees with all of its connotations. Because even though not everyone subscribes to using the term to denotate the geological era that we're currently living in, it is widely used, even in popular culture. And reservations are not unfounded, but there is a reason why the term is not only relevant within the context of my presentation. It is useful within this field of study overall because it draws attention to the sometimes uncomfortable fact that human activity negatively influences and alters the planet's climate and ecology. Thereby, it may lead to what Robert Nixon hopefully refers to as a greater sense of human responsibility by aiding to guide humans towards awareness of the consequences of their actions. As Earl Ellis formulates it, the significance of the Anthropocene resides in its role as a new lens through which age-old narratives and philosophical questions are being revisited and rewritten, with the potential to radically revise the way we think of what it means to be human. Thus, using the Anthropocene as a lens, it allows us to zoom in on the flaws within the predominant Western worldview. With growing awareness of the human involvement in our planet's evolution, it has become more and more evident that a worldview that posits humans not only outside of but above nature is a gross oversimplification and detrimental to the planet's and with that our own survival. As David Grinspoon says, the Anthropocene represents a braiding together of these, human history, geological time, biological time, into one inseparable narrative. This is the end of history and of biology and geology, at least as separate narratives. That is where ecocriticism comes in. As a literary critical approach, ecocriticism explores the complex relationship among a wide variety of subjects tied to the question of the relation between humans, nature, and literature. It questions the ways in which human-nature interactions are portrayed in literature and culture, and it challenges the binary opposition of humans versus nature that ultimately severs the ties connecting these entities and therefore artificially constructs the human and the non-human as dichotomous, separable, essentially different and disconnected categories. Cheryl Glotfelty, one of the co-editors of the Ecocriticism Reader, argued that one of the central duties of ecocriticism has always been drawing attention to not only the prevalent ecological situation, but also humanity's role in it, very similar in tone to Ellis and Nixon's statements on the importance of raising awareness in order to prompt a renegotiation. Ultimately, the ways in which human sense-making is structured and the ways in which humans collectively act within the world reciprocally influence each other. And as long as humans live, act, and think according to fundamentally anthropocentric axioms, a change in human behavior significant enough to counteract or at least lessen the impact of the damage that has already been done will be impossible. Relative autonomy. So what does this renegotiation that I have alluded to multiple times now entail? One of the main problems of anthropocentrism is that it suggests the conception of humans and nature as binary opposites. The reason why that is harmful is because, for one thing, dichotomies are upheld not only through difference, but through an implied hierarchy. Through that, binaries usually endorse readings of literary images of nature that push nature into the background. Symbolic readings run the tendency of being reductive because they portray nature as an externalization or dramatization of human concerns. Thus, traditional reading strategies that tend to read nature as a metaphor or dramatization of human affairs and concerns are inherently anthropocentric in that they devalue nature, because when nature imagery is reduced to a mere symbol or metaphor, nature is denied its own agency. Ecocriticism, in contrast, does not believe in privileging human concerns. But reading ecocritically doesn't mean automatically rejecting literary images. As Howard Berridge aptly states, a symbol should be thought of as what it physically is, as well as being what it symbolizes. The challenge then is to find a way of reading literary images ecocritically, an ecocentric approach that values nature in itself instead of denouncing its autonomy and agency by reading it as mere symbol, setting, or backdrop. Critically engaging with literary images of nature, including metaphors, allegories, and any kind of literary illustration, can urge the reader to reflect on the ways in which the human-nature relationship is portrayed within a literary work and how these depictions are received and interpreted. Thus, in order to be able to read nature as an actor, the non-human first needs to be conceived of as a subject rather than a passive object. And in order to do so, agency cannot be understood as a capability reserved for humans, but instead as a capability of the non-human as well. As proposed, for example, by actor network theory, where, as Bruno Latour says, anything that does modify a state of affairs by making a difference is an actor. As already mentioned, to consider human history as separate from the geological or biological history of our planet is fallacious, since it presupposes that humans are distinguishable and detachable from nature. As a general rule, this distinction is based on human exceptionalism and anthropological difference. The idea that humans are separated from the non-human from and by nature. According to Deepesh Chakrabarty, this distinction has recently begun to collapse, as it is no longer simply a discussion of whether or not humans interact with nature, but that humans are actively changing their environment from a geological perspective, which challenges Western and, as Chakrabarty put it, universal political thought that is based on the assumption that nature exists as a separate realm. Bruno Latour makes similar arguments in Facing Gaia. In the Western tradition, most definitions of the human stress the extent to which it is distinguished from nature. As a result, every time we attempt to bring humans closer to nature, we are prevented from doing so by the objection that a human is above all, or is also a cultural being who has to escape from, to in any case be distinguished from, nature. And for Latour, the problem lies already in the way we think about or approach this issue. The difficulty lies in the very expression relation to the world, which presupposes two sorts of domains, that of nature and that of culture, domains that are at once distinct and impossible to separate completely, which means that we are not dealing with domains, but rather with one and the same concept divided into two parts, which turn out to be bound together. In the Western tradition, we never speak of the one without speaking of the other. They were born together as inseparable as Siamese twins who hug or hit each other without ceasing to belong to the same body. Drawing on Latour and the post-structuralists, I'd say we need to approach the dominant Western worldview as a text, one that is very evidently in need of being read against itself. By deconstructing the fundamental fallacies at the root of Western thinking, we would not simply be dismantling the worldview from the outside, but rather reassembling it from within. One example and another theoretical basis of my own understanding of humans and nature as interconnected that moves away from the age-old dualism of nature and humanity is James Lovelock's Gaia theory. It was first introduced in 1979 as an understanding of Earth as a superorganism comprised of many smaller suborganisms, all of which work together to make up a functioning system. Lovelock understands the Earth system as a complex interplay of organisms working together and comprising an overarching living system, Gaia. In that understanding, humans and nature are interwoven, reciprocally influential entities engaged in a ceaseless and highly complex interplay of intentional and unintentional actions, reactions, and therefore interaction. In line with Lovelock's challenge to the nature-human divide and Latour's taking issue with conceiving of nature and culture as separable domains, I work with an eco-critically motivated understanding of humans and nature as inseparable, entwined, and reciprocally influential entities. To summarize this relationship, I've chosen the term relative autonomy. In coining this as a concept that emphasizes the inseparability of humans and nature, relatively autonomous entities are recognizable as entities in that they are complex systems that function according to their own rules and principles. Yet the effects of actions performed within and by them carry over to the other. As a disclaimer, my use of the term differs from the Althusserien Marxist understanding of it in that it's not limited to the cultural realm and in that it considers entities as equals. Although my notion of relative autonomy considered entities as inseparable in a similar way, it considers them as virtually codependent, not only one entity as dependent as in the base and superstructural model. Therefore, it puts more emphasis on interconnectedness and interaction as opposed to dependency. It also differs from the semiotic term used to describe the stance of language towards reality within the Saussurian model, where it is used to describe one entity's stance in regard to another, rather than that of both entities and their relation. I've built my concept on an understanding of autonomy as a state of self-governance and a state of awareness of the self and other entities. And then I realized I needed to specify my intention, and that is where the adjective relative comes in. As has become evident over the last few decades, humans are unable to act completely detached from nature. Any and every action is, at least to a certain degree, influenced by and in turn influences the environment. That is to say, human activity as a whole can only ever be considered relatively autonomous. Thus, loosely borrowing from Bruno Latour, one of the key conditions is that everything, whether human or non-human, has agency. To be a subject is not to act autonomously in front of an objective background, but to share agency with other subjects that have also lost their autonomy. In that vein, I define relative autonomy as a state of coexistence characterized by interaction, interconnectedness, and reciprocal relation, rather than differentiation, all the while retaining to a certain degree the given entity's independence by acknowledging their individuality and commonality equivocally. The word relative underlines the fact that entities are codependent, defining themselves in relation to each other and through their differences as well as similarities, while autonomy emphasizes the fact they are still, to a certain degree, distinguishable entities, governed by their respective principles. Thus, relatively autonomous entities are, self as well as other-directed, interconnected rather than isolated, and inseparable as they interact with and reciprocally influence each other. Nature or the non-human and humans have all of these three qualities. This understanding of the human-nature relationship is also a more accurate reflection of the way in which nature and humanity are represented in the postbellum novels that I have analyzed so far within the framework of my thesis. The analysis of the literary texts will show to which degree the dichotomy can be considered a useful basic assumption upon which to expand in order to arrive at an alternative. It will help display the ways in which representations of nature and humans in war and post-war literature may contribute to the establishment of an understanding of nature, and with that, humans and a relationship between the two that departs from the traditional anthropocentric conception. This, in turn, will allow for a renegotiation of this relationship towards a more ecocentric conception of humans and nature. It follows then that nature and humanity will be seen as interconnected rather than opposite sides of a dualism and treated as not entirely independent, but relatively autonomous. Ecocritical rereadings of war literature. War literature offers itself as an ideal breeding ground for ecocritical rereadings because it negotiates the relationship between humans and nature in a unique and meaningful way. The fact that human activity on the planet always bears consequences in regards to the environment has been established by scientists and scholars in the past decades. Warfare is a paradigmatic example of an extreme case of human-nature interaction, and especially of human impact on nature as a byproduct of usually strictly human affairs. As Joseph Hoopy says, warfare is a unique form of landscape disturbance in that it is often larger in magnitude and size than any other forms of anthropogenic disturbance. In this regard, war literature is an example of a narrative discourse that enters a dialogue with the theory of the Anthropocene in that it urges the reader to reflect on human-nature interaction. As Toby C. Herzog names in regard to Vietnam War stories, they tell readers a lot about people, including storytellers. The best tales cut through ideological cant and battlefield action to explore often disturbing, ambiguous, and complex elements of war, human behavior, and life, which can also be said of war literature in general. Arguably, Herzog is not following an ecocritical motivation, but his observation is still relevant to the question of why war literature is suited for an ecocritical reading. Good war stories, according to him, are thus more than mere retellings of events. They are explorations of a vast variety of often complex subjects, such as human attitudes and behavioral patterns, which enables the discourse on humans' attitudes and behavior towards the environment. Moreover, the ways in which the individual is often devalued in war and post-war narratives is reflective of the way in which ecocriticism decenters the human by denying it its acclaimed position at the apex of creation. Ecocriticism aims for a more ecocentric view, since, as Brian Moore put it, ecocentrism places intrinsic value on all forms of life, independent of their value for humans. Many characters within war and post-war literature appear as disillusioned, alienated, unstable, fragmented, and the genesis of a unified subject is circumstantially made impossible. Characters often express sentiments of alienation, isolation, identity fragmentation, other determination, and loss of direction, not unreflective of the way in which the anthropocentric human feels when confronted with a worldview that does not place them at the center. These characters then often embark on an ontological journey to find their place in the world, and in relation to the non-human. The additional loss of personality or individuality that often occurs as soldiers are usually reduced to their position or function within the company or regiment leads to deliberations of agency or loss thereof and feelings of other determination. These go hand in hand with the question of free will, which in turn is inextricably bound to the idea of anthropological difference and whether or not agency and self-determined theological actions is capability limited to humans. Another way in which war and post-war literature often decenters its characters is through their experience of alienation from this society. Within my corpus, this implies civilian US society. The distance created between the individuals and society leads to characters and readers alike reflecting upon their understanding of the world in general as something constructed and conditioned, and very often they find that their view of the world and their sense-making is only applicable within that given society sphere. That then leads to implicit and also sometimes explicit questions raised concerning what it means to be an individual as a human, as part of a society, as part of an overarching natural environment, and as opposed to being a non-human within the context of nature. In that way, these texts often overtly and at times covertly question the reigning episteme of their society, namely anthropocentric Western thought. From an eco-critical viewpoint, these types of reflections are extremely beneficial as they initiate a renegotiation of the anthropocentric worldview. Reading strategy. There are different ways in which texts may address the topic of the nature-human relationship. Aside from the self-evident explicit statements by narrators or characters within these works, there are more implicit ways in which the topic is raised. Thus, there are certain themes, devices, and motives to look out for, which can aid in exposing a work's potentially eco-critical subtext. I will explain each of these in more detail as we work our way through the text during the remainder of today's lecture. But for the sake of giving you a quick roadmap, these topics include the theme of death, or rather the omnipresence of death within war and post-war narratives, the decentering of the individual, that is to say, characters or human actors, the debunking of dualisms in general, and, aided by anthropomorphisms within the text, the specific diffusion or destabilization of the nature versus culture or nature versus human dichotomy. An eco-critical rereading of the Red Badge of Courage. Stephen Crane rose to fame almost overnight with the publication of the Red Badge of Courage in 1895, when he was only 23 years old. John Condor admiringly refers to his Civil War novel as Crane's masterpiece of psychological realism, and to this day it remains one of the most widely read works of war literature. The narration follows 18-year-old Union soldier Henry Fleming, often referred to simply as the Youth, depicting his personal battle with himself as well as his actions in the war as he first flees the battlefield, only to find himself longing for his own Red Badge of Courage, a wound to attest to his bravery. In the end, he overcomes what he perceives to be cowardice and stands his ground as the flag bearer of his regiment. As I've already mentioned in the introduction, nature in the Red Badge of Courage is often said to be indifferent towards humans or human affairs. In 1962, James Tuttleton, for example, said that nature is neither malign nor benevolent, but simply indifferent or uncognizant of man. A statement I find difficult from today's perspective, especially regarding the term uncognizant, which means unaware, in addition to indifferent, which already implies a lack of interest or concern. And as Max Westbrook points out, Crane's belief is that the lesson of nature's indifference is an elementary lesson, However, I'd like to use a quote by John Condor, who also says that nature in the Red Badge of Courage is indifferent, to transition into the discussion on why I believe an eco-critical reading of this text may warrant a different outcome. The conflict which dominates the central part of the action is the clash between man's fear of extinction and his psychological capacity for experiencing guilt. The one, his animal instinct for survival, binds him to nature. The other, his capacity to internalize social codes and hence to experience guilt, defines his distinctiveness in nature. The psychological faculty, of course, does not separate him from nature. Thus, in a way, Henry, or humans in general, appear as a space of aporia, a place where nature versus culture dichotomy can no longer be sustained, as he is simultaneously embedded and distinguished from nature. As Henry's key actions are determined by two main emotions, namely fear and guilt, an instinctual or natural emotion and a socially conditioned one, he appears as the perfect example of humans' embeddedness within nature and culture, and as the emblem of the relative autonomy that characterizes their relationship. Death, decentering, and the debunking of dualisms. The decentering of the human that automatically occurs when aiming to overcome anthropocentrism and its corollary assumption that humans are the pinnacle of creation is central to ecocriticism, and at the same time, it is an imperative precondition of a more ecocentric worldview. In Tim O'Brien's The Things They Carried, the decentering of the human is most overtly conveyed through the decentering of subjectivity, more specifically through the character's experience of alienation. That, in turn, is closely related to the devaluing and the decentering of the individual in the context of war. According to Herzog, the soldiers find themselves in a chaotic environment where often they have little or no control over their actions and fate, mere cogs in the military machine. And as the narrator in The Things They Carried says, the filth seemed to erase identities, transforming the men into identical copies of a single soldier, interchangeable units of command. This erasure of the individual raises questions concerning what it means to be human as part of a society, but it can also be extended to the question what it means to be human rather than non-human in the context of nature. The thereby associated focal shift away from the individual initiates a renegotiation of the anthropocentric worldview, motivated by the realization that humans are not exceptional, and especially that individual human concerns are insignificant in the grander scheme of things. That in turn is symbolic of the ways in which human concerns measure on a larger scale, such as that of planetary time, because the time span inhabited by humans is an infinitesimal segment. The story suggests a conception of humans as contextually bound and inextricable from their environment, making it paramount to acknowledge the contexts in which humans act, culturally constructed and natural alike. The individual's position within a culturally determined collective is a smaller scale example of each human's position within the larger context of society, nature, or nature overall. The typical post-war fragmentation of subjectivity then goes hand in hand with the decentering and devaluing of the individual, as well as the therewith connected alienation from society and civilian life. The latter estranges and disconnects the soldiers, not only from the people and places that they left behind to fight in the war, but also from their past selves and ultimately themselves. In his analysis of Stephen Crane's The Red Badge of Courage, James Dawes states that through a self-willed ignorance, we're typically able to maintain the single coherent view of subjectivity or intimacy. But in unexpected traumatic crises, such as an encounter with death, we can be jarred into assuming the objective view. Our acknowledgement of the view renders us as trivial. Our evasion of it renders us absurd. Encounters with death and traumatic combat experiences reveal to the soldiers not only their own mortality, but they often result in dissociation and being jarred into an objective stance, which is a radical form of decentering. Hand in hand with an acknowledgement of their triviality, the soldiers are confronted with their connection to their fellow humans, even their enemies, as they realize they're not so different after all, and consequently not exceptional. That is to say, their devaluation in the context of the military doesn't allow for soldier subjects to view themselves as exceptional or important as individuals within the framework of war. And this leads to the realization of the fact that in the even grander context of nature, they're also not exceptional. This narrative of realization prompts awareness of the fact that humans are, after all, very much the same in the broader context of nature and in essence, part of nature. The imminent danger of death within war literature, then, can be read as a traditional memento mori, in that it functions as a reminder of the impermanence of life, but also of the fact that all life, including human life, is transient and thus determined by nature. Collectively, the memento mori culminate into what I call memento naturae, reminders of the fact that humans are very much a part of nature. This derivative concept encompasses a greater range of literary imagery, such as parallelisms, particular instances of personifications or anthropomorphisms, memento mori, and explicit comparisons and reflections on the connection between humans and nature. Thus, memento naturae can function as both reminders of human transience and of the embeddedness of humans within nature. In the things they carry, this development from memento mori to memento naturae is beautifully self-evident within the numerous mentions of the proximity to death as intensifying the experience of life, pointing directly at the issue underlying the simple notion of binary oppositions. These instances result in a heightened awareness of life in the face of death, evoking an understanding of humans as anchored within nature by their mortality. And if being aware of one's mortality and the world is what it takes to feel truly alive, being caught within anthropocentric paradigms is a removal of the self from life as it clouds perception. In addition, death functioning as an amplifier of life destabilizes the dichotomy insofar as a full experience of life is dependent upon an acceptance and proximity to death, shifting the focus from the oppositional nature of the two to their connection. The omnipresence and acute awareness of death in combat emphasizes that human life is determined by nature and that death is an inevitable part of any and every life. Thus, combat evokes a significantly amplified acute awareness of one's mortality, and with that, humans are inscribed into nature. In the Red Badge of Courage, in which Henry Fleming is often referred to as youth instead of called by his name, which is a depersonalization in itself, death perforce is a constant companion. Similar to the way in which the things they carried stresses not solely the threat of impending death as experienced by the soldiers, but the ways in which an acute awareness of death results in acceptance of one's mortality and leads to the ability of experiencing life in an unmediated way. Close readings of key passages from the Red Badge of Courage that are concerned with death suggest that an acceptance of death and one's mortality is an integral part of the combat experience. One example can be found in the following excerpt, which illustrates the link between memento mori and memento naturae. That is to say, the link between awareness of one's mortality or proximity to death and embedment within nature. The ranks opened covertly to avoid the corpse. The invulnerable dead man forced a way for himself. The youth looked keenly at the ashen face. The wind raised the tawny beard. It moved as if a hand were stroking it. The way the soldiers make way for the corpse is emblematic of their fear of death, as they quite literally evade it. The fact that the dead man is characterized as invulnerable draws attention to the fact that they, being alive, are not invulnerable. Additionally, the corpse is said to force a way for himself, turning him into an active subject despite being dead, undermining the life-death dichotomy, destabilizing a central dualism of Western thought. Most interestingly, though, nature embraces the dead man by raising his beard with the wind as if stroking it, quite literally embedding him within herself, actively engaging with the human through the anthropomorphism in the hand comparison and use of the active verb form, challenging the subject-object classification at the root of the human-nature dichotomy and quite literally encapsulating the human. Dawes concludes in his analysis of Crane's An Episode of War that as humans, we are reprehensible if we remain attached to our personal desires and goals, despite our realization that, quote unquote, the universe is malignant and brutal, and our desires have no place in it. Yet it seems that war literature paints an even darker image by rendering individual concerns absurd not only in the grander scheme of the universe, but even in the context of society, as these soldiers are completely denied individuality and free will. Thus, these traumatic incidences, the paradigm being an encounter with death, not only foreground the triviality of individual human existence, but the fact that a human's place within nature and culture may not be so different, as they're embedded within both, attesting to the relative autonomy of the human and the non-human. Anthropomorphisms. Over the course of my analyses, I have found that one of the ways in which nature is often enabled as a subject rather than a passive object is through anthropomorphisms. Anthropomorphizing an entity means attributing human characteristics or activities to the non-human. Initially, this may give the impression that anthropomorphisms are inherently anthropocentric. That is because the presupposition is that actions are teleological and can therefore only be performed by humans, and the only way in which agency can be ascribed to the non-human is by humanizing it, so to speak. However, as Bruno Latour argues in Agency at the Time of the Anthropocene, rather than always pointing out the danger of anthropomorphizing natural entities, we should be just as wary of avoiding the oddity of fusomorphizing them, that is, of giving them the shape of objects defined only by their causal antecedents. The issue then is not anthropomorphizing entities as such, since anthropomorphisms add depth to entities that are usually perceived as one-dimensional and creates a connection between the human and the non-human that puts them on equal footing. The problem lies solely in the predominant definition of anthropomorphism that presupposes an artificial divide between humans and the non-human in regard to their actions, and by rejecting the idea that the actions ascribed to the non-human are an exclusively human capability, as proposed, for example, by actor network theory, we can allow anthropomorphisms to function as enablers of nature. Tim O'Brien's The Things They Carried features an abundance of instances in which anthropomorphisms aid in depicting nature as an active entity, such as in the following excerpts. The trees are alive, the grass, the soil, everything. All around you, things are purely living, and you among them, and the aliveness makes you tremble. Or, like the night had its own voice, you'd swear you were walking through some soft black protoplasm, Vietnam, the blood and the flesh. The agency ascribing anthropomorphizing of nature occurs most ostensibly when the active verb form is used to describe activities of the non-human, as you could see in these examples. Sometimes the anthropomorphisms also suggest that nature is not only active, but that nature and humans interact, such as in the following example from James Webb's Fields of Fire. A gust of wind swooped down from the amber mist of sky and chased him, rattling trash. Next to him, the door of an abandoned row house swung open and banged. He climbed the outside steps, finally being chased inside by another gust of wind. By focusing on the way in which anthropomorphisms ascribe agency to the non-human by foregrounding their similarities and the fact that nature is equally an actor, this strategy allows for detection of a non-dualistic conception of the nature-human relationship within these texts. The Red Badge of Courage also has many passages in which nature appears as an active subject through the use of active verb forms and as interacting with humans. He was obliged to force his way with much noise. The creepers, catching against his legs, cried out harshly as their sprays were torn from the barks of trees. The swishing saplings tried to make known his presence to the world. He could not conciliate the forest. As he made his way, it was always calling out protestations. When he separated embraces of trees and vines, the disturbed foliages waved their arms and turned their face leaves towards him. The use of anthropomorphisms in this passage suggests, for one thing, that nature is disturbed, affected, and influenced by the human presence. For another, it attests to the fact that nature is not merely a background upon or in front of which to act, but an actor in its own right. The way nature is portrayed within this excerpt, it appears as an antagonist, as it is described as fighting back and reacting to Henry's human presence, and most importantly, as acting. The anthropomorphism occurs, as in the previous examples, through the use of active verb forms, as creepers, which are plants that grow on the ground or on the surface of other plants, are said to cry out, try to make his presence known, call out protestations, wave and turn. Additionally, the use of terms usually reserved to describe human or animal bodies, such as face or arms, further reinforces the image of nature as an anthropomorphized entity, and in turn, as an actor, not unlike the present human actor. Henry's escape from the battle through the forest then can be used to illustrate the way in which war is never fought only among humans, but always also an engagement with the environment, fought against the environment in many ways, as Herzog also stated. Even though Henry is moving away from the site of battle, he is still in the war and at war, and nature is not a mere setting, but an active antagonist. The branches pushing against him threatened to throw him over. The trees began softly to sing a hymn of twilight. There was silence, save for the chanted chorus of the trees. These repeated anthropomorphisms enable nature as an actor and challenge the nature-culture dualism. Letting the trees sing and chant, lending them the capability to speech, so to say, ascribes the faculty of language, of the intentionally melodic use of a voice, to nature, a capability usually understood as human. Therefore, these anthropomorphisms counteract the conception of humans as essentially different from nature, aiding in the establishment of nature and humans as equally valuable agents. By ascribing the same actions and capabilities to humans and the non-human, their similarities rather than their differences are highlighted, and especially in interaction, as we've seen in this first excerpt, their relative autonomy is illustrated and nature's indifference is challenged. Diffusing the divide. Another way in which the text puts emphasis not on the distinction between the human and the non-human, but their similarities, is in the vast abundance of human-animal comparisons. On pages 14 and 15, the regiment is described as crawling reptiles and serpents. On page 31, Henry is said to have developed the acute exasperation of a pestered animal. On page 32, a dying officer's eyes are described as sheep-like and animal-like. Later, Henry is said to run like a rabbit. A man is described as mouse-colored. A dead soldier's eyes compared to those of a dead fish. Armies are likened to panthers. A moth-like quality keeps Henry in the proximity of battle. The soldiers are said to charge like buffaloes, the army as huddling like sheep, and so on. These examples are only a selection of the animal comparisons found within the Red Badge of Courage. What these comparisons show is that instead of upholding and reinforcing the human nature dichotomy, the text shifts the reader's focus onto shared qualities by highlighting features in humans that are comparable to animal features and behavior, thereby underlining the similarities rather than the differences between the human and the non-human, and rejecting the idea of human exceptionalism. Thereby, these animal comparisons function as memento naturae in that they embed humans within nature by emphasizing the ways in which humans are not distinct from nature. In addition, there is another instance where the text suggests in a very similar way that nature and humans are intertwined. By blending the regiment into the natural environment, the passage challenges the idea of nature as simply and solely a passive background. At nightfall, the column, which is the regiment, broke into regimental pieces, and the fragments went into the fields to camp. Tents sprang up like strange plants. Campfires, like red peculiar blossoms, dotted the night. As readers, we first encounter the fragmentation that is typical for war narratives and which emblematizes the chaos of war, as the individual soldiers are described as pieces or fragments that are part of a larger whole. This shows the devaluation of the individual that is characteristic for war novels. And while the first sentence in isolation may simply suggest that these parts are the individual units of the regiment, the following sentences add another dimension. The tents erected are said to spring up like strange plants, anthropomorphizing them and giving them agency, as no human actor is described to aid in putting up of the tents, furthering the soldiers' shift from active subjects to passive objects. As the regiment dissolves, so do the soldiers, who in the context of war are not of importance save their function. Moreover, the fact that the tents are likened to plants and the campfires subsequently described as peculiar blossoms suggests a settling into nature of the regiment. However, the adjectives strange and peculiar still emphasize a certain difference. Therefore, this can be read as a paradigmatic example of relative autonomy as portrayed by a text through imagery. While still recognizably different, the human and the non-human are narrated in the same way, described in a way that emphasizes their similarities, and thus they intermingle in a way that, while the human may still be recognizable as an entity, it blends into, or rather is embedded into, nature. A similar type of anthropomorphizing of objects, analogous to the tents that spring up, which are not natural but also not human, yet human-made, appears only a little later on in the narrative. The shells, which had ceased to trouble the regiment for a time, came swirling again and exploded in the grass or among the leaves of the trees. They looked to be strange war flowers bursting into fierce blooms. As in the first excerpt, the object, here the shells, are described in a way that absolves humans of their responsibility or involvement in the action, as the shells are said to have ceased and then come swirling again of their own accord. And when taking into consideration the comparison of the explosions of the shells to strange war flowers, we as readers are again confronted with a kind of naturalization through anthropomorphism and nature comparison. That is to say, as the object is anthropomorphized, it functions as an equalizer of the human and the non-human by appearing in connection with the nature comparison. The absence of human subjects initiates a shift from subject to object on part of the human, and the action and agency that is attributed to the non-human in nature initiates a shift from object to subject on part of the non-human. While the anthropomorphism challenges the nature-human divide by emphasizing the similarities between the human and the non-human and foregrounding nature's agency, nature or animal comparison do so as well. But additionally, they underline the embeddedness or settling into the environment of the humans. The fact that human agents are, in both of the excerpts discussed, not active participants of the action, further emphasizes the fact that humans are not above nature, and their interaction attests again to how nature is certainly not unaffected by the human activity of war. Explicit commentary. Interestingly, even though war and post-war literature are inarguably far from nature writing in the traditional sense, narrators and characters often make explicit comments on their own assessment of the nature-human relationship or their stance concerning the human versus nature dichotomy. In The Things They Carried, the narrator Tim says, "Everything seemed part of everything else," while Dan in Fields of Fire claims that there is no difference between rain and war. And the equation of a culturally determined occurrence and a natural process allows the text to transcend and destabilize the nature-human binary. Later on in Fields of Fire, Lieutenant Hodges reiterates the statement by saying, "Some days it rains rain, some days it rains other things." Thus, these characters draw a similar analogy as the one we previously discussed from The Red Badge of Courage, where artillery is described as strange war flowers. But here, he is actively foregrounding the similarities between nature and human actions. And though this analogy may be debatable, these types of comments contribute to an overall conception of humans and nature as not as characterized by difference as the traditional dichotomy suggests. In the Red Badge of Courage, there are a total of 4 notable explicit comments made concerning nature and its role, involvement, or lack thereof in the war. The first one is from towards the beginning of the text. This advance upon nature was too calm. He had opportunity to reflect. He had time in which to wonder about himself and to attempt to probe his sensations. Absurd ideas took hold of him. He thought that he did not relish the landscape. It threatened him. A coldness swept over his back. And it is true that his trousers felt to him that they were no fit for his legs at all. A house standing placidly in distant fields had to him an ominous look. The shadows of the woods were formidable. It was all a trap. Suddenly, the close forests would bristle with rifle barrels. Henry feels like an alien in a strange and hostile environment, as he expresses feeling like the landscape around him is threatening. Yet his ideas are said to be absurd, though it isn't specified which part of this thought process renders them so. Is it the fact that he feels threatened, or the fact that he feels he's not relishing, as in taking pleasure in the landscape in the way that he should? His trousers feel like they don't fit, in addition to the cold that overtakes him, and that can be seen as an expression of feeling utterly uncomfortable, but also as emblematic of the ways in which he does not feel like himself as part of the regiment, as a soldier. The army-issued pants being ill-fitting could then be extended to the overall feeling of hostility that pervades this passage. And even though it seems the danger is emitted from the threatening nature around him as the forests bristle with rifle barrels, it is not the woods that appear formidable, causing fear, but the house in the fields that, with its ominous look, functions as a symbol for impending danger. Thus, while explicitly Henry is voicing concerns, especially about the landscape, an attentive reader will notice that he doesn't feel calmed by the human or cultural elements either. Additionally, even though the rifle barrels appear without human agents, they're a clear example of the fact that the violence that Henry really fears is not a threat from nature, but from humans. The next appearance of nature with a capital N can be used to underline the often reiterated assessment of Crane that in the Red Badge of Courage, nature appears entirely indifferent towards human affairs. As Henry muses, it was surprising that nature had gone tranquilly on with her golden process in the midst of such devilment. Here, nature is no longer threatening, but appears indifferent, unaffected, and somehow idyllic, contrasting the devilment of human activities. Thus, while nature appeared as a threat to Henry in the first passage, it is quite the opposite here, as nature seems entirely unscathed. There's a clear distinction between humans and nature, clearly denoting the former negatively and the nature positively. Thus, if taking into account this passage in isolation, one could conclude that nature and humans appear as opposites and nature as indifferent. The next explicit commentary on nature, then, appears to solidify this argument further. The insects were making rhythmical noises. They seemed to be grinding their teeth in unison. A woodpecker stuck his impudent head around the side of a tree. A bird flew on light-hearted wing. Off was the rumble of death. It seemed now that nature had no ears. This landscape gave him reassurance. A fair field holding life. It was the religion of peace. It would die if its timid eyes were compelled to see the blood. He conceived nature to be a woman with a deep aversion to tragedy. He threw a pine cone at a jovial squirrel and he ran with chattering fear. There was the law, he said. Nature had given him a sign. The squirrel immediately, upon recognizing danger, had taken to his legs without ado. He had fled as fast as his legs could carry him, and he was but an ordinary squirrel too, doubtless no philosopher of his race. The youth wended, feeling that nature was of his mind. She reinforced his argument with proofs. While the narrator, as in the preceding excerpt, is aiming to portray nature as unaffected, uninvolved, and indifferent, the atmosphere creates that is created is different. While before nature was either threatening, fighting back, or hostile, and thus uninvolved or indifferent, nature here is described as reassuring and peaceful, but also as impudent and as seemingly having an aversion to tragedy, no ears, timid eyes. The absence of nature's involvement or effect is explicitly described as a lack or an oppositional stance, the text thereby departing in tone from the image of purely idyllic nature. The reassuring landscape, as the nature narrator refers to its religion of peace, stands in stark contrast with the violence of the war and therefore with humans. Then again, Henry's interaction with the squirrel, rather his action and the squirrel's reaction, and the fact that the narrator says nature had given him a sign, suggests that nature is not entirely indifferent. Henry uses the scene to justify his choice to run when in the fight or flight situation of combat, and thereby draws an analogy between himself and the squirrel, equating himself as a human with a non-human animal. Moreover, nature is said to have given a sign to be of his mind and to having reinforced his argument, suggesting rather than a simply indifferent stance, nature is intervening and holds a clear position. Thus, to speak only of indifference and unquestionably maintaining the dichotomy in this case would be reductive. The following passage then takes yet another approach. Sometimes the brambles formed chains and tried to hold him back. Trees confronting him stretched out their arms and forbade him to pass. After its previous hostility, this new resistance of the forest filled him with a fine bitterness. It seemed that nature could not be quite ready to kill him. In addition to the instances of anthropomorphisms referred to earlier on, and the fact that anthropomorphizing the non-human ascribes agency to it, this passage exemplifies the ways in which anthropomorphisms actively work against the nature-human dichotomy and the traditional conception of nature imagery as background. Here, the brambles, which are prickly shrubs, are said to hold him back. The trees confront him, stretch out their arms, and forbid him to pass as he makes his way back to the battlefield. That is, the non-human is actively engaging with the human, resisting him, even if the narrator is to be taken at his word, trying to protect him from an untimely death. And do you remember the excerpt with the trees singing and the statement that nature had no ears? Well, as Henry is on his way back to battle, this takes a turn. As he ran, he became aware that the forest had stopped its music, as if at last becoming capable of hearing the foreign sounds. The trees hushed and stood motionless. Everything seemed to be listening to the crackle and clatter and ear-shaking thunder. The chorus pealed over the still earth. Reading this with the other examples still fresh in our minds, it becomes self-evident that there is a constant tension between nature as uninvolved, unaffected, or indifferent, and nature as interacting, affected, and aware of the war. Similarly, there's a tension between the embedment of the soldiers, or humans more generally, within nature, as in the alliance and the protective stance of nature in the penultimate excerpt, the animal and nature comparisons and anthropomorphisms, which foreground the similarities between humans and the non-human, putting them on equal footing, and the reiteration of statements that suggest that nature is a separate sphere. This tension is illustrated most ostensibly in the first mention of nature with a capital N, where Henry feels threatened by nature, but also uncomfortable in his army-issued trousers. It seems as though neither fight nor flight, culture or nature are a perfect fit for Henry. As a character and especially as a human, Henry embodies the relative autonomy that defines the relationship between the human and the non-human in general and within this narrative. The irresolvable tension between humans as part of and apart from nature is only seemingly irresolvable. There is no way for humans to be apart from nature, but even being part of nature, there are certain features and characteristics that enable the detection of the human as a distinctive part of nature. That is why humans and nature can only ever be considered relatively autonomous. Consequently, it stands as undeniable that the devastation of the environment during the Civil War, the context of the Red Badge of Courage, was nowhere near as extensive as during later modern wars, such as the Second World War or the Vietnam War. But as previously mentioned, warfare in general is in itself a distinctive type of environmental disturbance. So even though the Red Badge of Courage may lend less invitations for a straightforward eco-critical reading than more recent war literature, there are, as we've seen, certain themes, motives, and devices that challenge the nature-culture binary and the separation of humans from nature. And it can certainly be said that eco-critical rereadings of war literature yield insightful contributions to the issue of the current ecological crisis by confirming and emphasizing the importance of a renegotiation of the nature-human relationship and a move away from anthropocentrism. The portrayal of nature, humans, and their relationship in Vietnam War literature very clearly departs from dualisms and the notion of human exceptionalism and that of anthropological difference. The Red Badge of Courage, in contrast, still oscillates a little more between maintaining the difference and yet also highlighting similarities and the embeddedness of humans within nature, thereby subverting the dichotomy. However, even its occupation of that liminal space between anthropo and ecocentrism is a challenge to the anthropocentrism at the root of Western thought. Henry Fleming, then, the soldier that, as John Condor already established, is torn between nature and culture and is emblematic of the novel's overall tendencies. Through memento mori and memento naturae, anthropomorphisms, animal and nature comparisons, explicit interactions between the human and the non-human environment, and especially the explicit commentary, the Red Badge of Courage offers numerous prompts for readers to reflect upon the nature-human relationship. The text portrays humans and nature as intricately connected, interacting, and reciprocally influential entities. In other words, relatively autonomous entities. Ultimately, his analysis shows that when approaching a classic work of literature such as The Red Badge of Courage from a new perspective, layers of the text may be exposed that have remained hidden. That is one of the beauties of eco-criticism. The focus is not on the discrediting of scholarship, but on adding onto the existing body of work by shedding light onto formerly overlooked dimensions. In this case, by shifting the spotlight to include non-human actors. That is to say, by highlighting the decentering of the human within the text. Thank you.
Okay, I get back in the picture. Thank you very much, Anouk and Aerni. We have some time for questions, if there are any. From the online audience too, there's a possibility. So I can't see the chat, can you? Oh, okay. So if the online audience has questions, Damaris can see the chat. I can't at the moment. Well, I ask a question then. One that I've had for a while before we even got this chance here for this talk. Isn't naturalism already an attempt at decentering humans from the idea that realism still had? The topic of Stephen Crane's Times, the whole series, realism still putting humans and human agency at the center of any activity that's described in the books, and naturalism goes beyond that, and particularly Crane in not so much in The Red Badge of Courage, but famously so in The Open Boat. And here, if you look particularly at the examples, the last ones that you quoted, the question is whether we see this as typical 19th century realist sort of omniscient narrative, as Stansel would have had it, or whether this is Henry's personal viewpoint. And depending on which perspective you take, it becomes more naturalist and his agency in it less graspable, less of a factor even. Yeah.
Yes. Which quote were you referring to from the text?
The last ones.
The last ones, yeah, with the interaction and the anthropomorphisms.
Where he seems to switch between a more naturalist view and then back to seeing nature as, in fact, partaking in the activity somehow and reacting to humans.
Yes, I think I would agree that naturalism definitely decenters the human already to a certain degree. As I am most focused on the fact that on more the postbellum qualities of the text and how war novels in general already decenter the human, which is in a way paradox, because war as a subject is concerned most overtly with humans. You have human antagonists and you have human actors that are actually the focal point of these narratives. But I think the interesting thing is that when you actually read these texts and you really go into them and you realize that these interactions are not only taking place between the human actors, but also between humans and their environment. I think that's where the interesting shift happens, where another actor is brought into play that isn't actually thought of in the process, because it's not, we don't think of engaging with nature when we engage in war. And I think that's the most interesting point here, is that we don't have nature on the screen when we start talking about war literature, when we talk about war in general. And it's not as interesting, I will admit, when talking about the Red Badge of Courage, the Civil War. It gets way more interesting and way more difficult when you talk about, for example, the Vietnam War, because there the engagement with nature is very profound and it's very straightforward. And that was not as easy to get from Crane, because there is no straightforward interaction with nature. There is more of a byproduct, that actually the interaction is more of a byproduct, I would say.
So Crane is really one of the first, if not the first, to do this, and I would claim consciously and deliberately.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, he reacts to such things as the Battles and Leaders of the Civil War series, Century magazine originally, where the action is reduced to an altercation between people. Mm-hmm. And the genius of this leader versus the genius, the non-genius or not so genius of that leader. And in environmental aspects hardly ever play a role, except maybe in the report. It's a short one about the Tullahoma campaign, which was conducted in 21 days of incessant rain, where the prayer of a Union soldier during the Tullahoma campaign becomes, now I lay me down to sleep in mud that's several fathoms deep. If I'm not there when you awake, hunt me up with an oyster rake. Where war becomes an impossibility because of, or the proper warfare becomes an impossibility because of the things that nature does, which is completely outside of what the soldiers can do about it.
But I also think
so Crane is really unique here, and I remember a conference years back where one of the participants claimed that the next thing after Stephen Crane that does this and applies this consciously are stories about the Boer War, mm-hmm. Where the environment takes on a quality that almost has already Vietnam War qualities, where you sometimes wonder, well, who's the enemy and where's the enemy? And the very countryside seems to be acting against you. And that was in German, and I still remember the term Bodentruppen. You know, the Boers were Bodentruppen, not as opposed to Air Force or Navy, but because they seem to spring out of the soil and return to it. Mm-hmm. That might be interesting for your argumentation to include at some point. It's I think I can find the source. This might be interesting.
That'd be great. Yes. What I also just realized that I forgot to add is one of the most interesting aspects about reading Stephen Crane this way is that he is always referred to in any collection of the classic war novels to read. He's always the first one to go really deep into the psychology of the character. He's always said to be the first to really delve deeply into the character. And the interesting thing is that the further you go into the character, the more you have an engagement with nature. Because the engagement with nature in this novel really starts when Henry starts debating whether or not he should run or stay. And that's when he starts debating his own nature. And how this topic really comes up is by him going deep into himself and the narrator really delving into Henry and bringing up the topic of nature. So the further you go into the human, the more you realize that the human is embedded within nature, maybe.
Yeah, even though his argument with himself in a position to or alignment with the squirrel, I'm not sure if that's really, if that has anything to do with nature, if that isn't just all inside his head. There's one scene that I think might support your argument even better than this one does with the squirrel, and that's when he does encounter the next corpse, the dead soldier in the woods, who must have been lying there already for at least weeks, if not months. And
it's on his face already.
I think I can prove where he got that image and this whole scenery, and also the dead soldiers in the field. That's a photograph that Crane must have known. But this dead man sitting there and already being sort of decomposing, returning to nature, so to speak, nature taking over the dead bodies. That was an experience that had to do directly with the Battle of Chancellorsville, where many of the dead were not found afterwards and couldn't be and were not buried. And when the Battle of the Wilderness happened over the same terrain the year after, soldiers stumbled over these half decomposed bodies, which must have been pretty grisly. And that's where Crane got that from. But in the context of your argument, that fits very nicely with sort of the relationship, the shifting relationship to nature.
Yeah, you have that return to nature after death in many post-war novels. I think it's William March's Company K, where the narrator in the very beginning, he talks to his wife, and I don't remember if she says it or the narrator himself, but something along the ways of the bodies that were there, they are now fertilizer to the ground. So you have this whole circle or cycle of life kind of thing. But then you still have the tension again with the death in combat versus the natural death, but then still the return to nature. So there's
doesn't it become natural death insofar as nature sort of reclaims these guys, or however they die?
Mm-hmm. You always have the reclaiming of nature, yes.
Okay, other questions? I see a shaking of heads here. Okay, then you're free. There will be logs, learning logs that may contain questions. I'll send them to you if there's anything interesting in them, so you can respond to these people directly if you want to.
Sure.
Other than that, thank you very much again, Anouk, Aerni, and I owe you one. You know, next time we actually meet, first time we met, I think, was in 2018. So 2022 sounds like a good chance. When's the next ICOR? I think in April.
I'm not sure, actually.
April should be good for actually being done with lockdowns and restrictions and so on.
Let's all hope for that.
It is in Basel, isn't it?
I think it's in, I'm really not sure, but I think it's Basel's turn.
Yeah, so great. I'm looking forward to that. Again, thank you very much, and bye for now.
Bye.